So in this section, what I'd like to do is give a little bit of background to therapeutic theories. So often with mental health difficulties, we will recommend that people seek therapy, or sometimes called counseling or psychotherapy. And often people don't really know what this is. So what I wanted to do is just give a little background to the therapeutic theories that underpin, I guess, the three main types of therapy that are out there. In order to do that, one of the things that we need to do is to kind of go back a bit in history and give a bit of a grounding. So if we go back to, I guess, the time when religion was the predominant understanding of mental health, the way that mental health was understood, or poor mental health, is that people were possessed. People were possessed by demons. They were afflicted, and things like these demons would infest a person, would occupy a person, would possess a person. And the way that that was dealt with was by a priest and was through exorcism. So for a long time, while religion was the main dominant power in the world, this was the way that mental health was understood. This became supplanted a little later on by medicine. When medicine became more dominant, medicine began to see mental health as coming under its domain. But the problem is that mental health really didn't have a lot of answers. Medicine started asylums where people were often held and sometimes subjected to fairly barbaric treatments. Sometimes even used as kind of exhibits. You can see on this slide that the people are the sort of middle class people, upper middle class people, used to come and visit places like Bethlehem Hospital in London, which is where we get the word Bedlam. And so people were fairly, they were looked after, but not very well. But there was no real understanding of a basis of any form of mental health. That came at the end of the 19th century with this person who you'll probably recognize as Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud was one of a number of people who started to explore ideas about the unconscious, and this is the first therapeutic modality we'll look at. Now, Freud and other people, but Freud was the spearhead of this movement around the unconscious, saw that poor mental health was something about unexpressed emotions. He said unexpressed emotions will never die, they're buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. And what he felt happened was that unexpressed emotions, conflicted emotions, were often repressed and placed in this thing called the unconscious. So what actually is it? Well, I mean, we can use an iceberg model to understand this. So with an iceberg, a small part of it is visible above the waterline, and a lot of it is below the waterline, as we know. So conscious thought, things that we're aware of, things that we know we're thinking, can be represented by this upper part of the iceberg that can be viewed. But what Freud said is that there's this huge repository of things that we are unaware of, called the unconscious. And this is a huge dark repository of unexpressed emotion, of wishes, of kind of primal urges. So what Freud came up with was a way to investigate the unconscious. And the way that he came up with was what's called psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis, the idea of psychoanalysis is that we find out what is in the unconscious and to make it conscious. And in doing so, that will relieve the ill mental health, or the neuroses, as it was called back then. So the way this was done was in lots of different ways. One of them was through dreams. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. So he felt that the dreams that we had were revealing what was actually happening in the unconscious. So what the analysts job was to interpret these dreams, to find out what these dreams meant. There were also things like this developed in psychoanalysis, which you probably recognize as the Rorschach Inkblot test. So this again was something that was put in front of the patient who would say what they could see in it. And this was something about that they used to interpret what was going on in the unconscious. So what would happen in psychoanalysis, the classical Freudian psychoanalysis, is that the patient is encouraged to lie down on a couch and basically open up, talk, free associate, come up with anything that they can come up with, images, thoughts, words, talk about their dreams. And it was the analyst's job to interpret this. Freud called analysts surgeons of the mind, who would sit and would try and understand what was going on in the unconscious. The client, the patient, as they were called then, was encouraged to just talk freely. And between them, they would work out what these unconscious conflicts were, and thus that's where the cure would come from. Classical psychoanalysis such as this does still exist. People do work this way. It's a very intense way of working. It can sometimes be 4 or 5 sessions a week. But what's tend to happen is that this thinking is carried on through to what these days we would call psychodynamic therapy. So it carries the same sort of principles of unconscious patterns of thinking, relating, unconscious emotions, and it carries it through to a more kind of modern way of thinking. So if you're often looking at a therapist and they say that they're a psychodynamic therapist, that's really what that means. So that for the first 30 years of the 20th century, that was pretty much the predominant way of thinking in terms of kind of therapy. That started to change around the middle of the 20th century with this man. And this is Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers was an American psychologist, part of what's called the humanistic psychology movement, along with people like Abraham Maslow. And he thought differently to Freud. Although Freud purported to be listening to what's going on, what Rogers felt was, we think we listen, but very rarely do we listen with real understanding, true empathy. Yet listening of this very special kind is one of the most potent forces for change that I know. So Rogers' ideas behind mental ill health came strangely from Potato. Now, this might be an apocryphal tale, but this is one that's often told. So Rogers was living in the 1940s, 1950s, where there wasn't a lot of refrigeration. And so to keep vegetables and things cool and keep them fresh, they were kept in the cellar, and kept in a darkened cellar, which was cool and dark. Now, Rogers one day was collecting some vegetables for a meal, and he noticed that one of the potatoes had kind of rolled free and was near to a shaft of light that was coming through. He noticed that that potato was actually sprouting. It was growing. And what he extrapolated from this is that all organisms, the humble potato right up to humans, need the correct environment to be the best version of themselves. So if they don't have the right environment, they can't be the best version of themselves. They can't self-actualize. This is what he called it, self-actualized. And so what he saw with humans is that we're often not given the correct environment. We often have what are called conditions of worth. We have to be a certain way. We have to achieve. We have to do things right in order to be feel like we are valuable, like we have worth. So from this, what Rogers felt was really important in the therapeutic environment were 3 things. He thought there were more, but these are the 3 basic things. So he felt that the first thing was unconditional positive regard. So the client, he would call them, is dealt with in a scenario of complete non-judgment, that they're not judged, that the client is accepted for exactly who they are, and not dealt like they are, there's something wrong about them. but purely for who they are. The second one is empathy. And empathy, although this is a fairly common thing we talk about now, it was unusual in Roger's day. And what empathy actually means is experiencing someone else's emotions as if they were yours, but without getting tangled up in them. So it's about really, really connecting with somebody else's emotional experience. The third one is congruence. And what this means is therapy, the therapist is very much in line with themselves. They understand themselves. They're honest with themselves about their feeling. They're not pretending to be something else. So, for example, Freud's analyst was trying to be a surgeon of the mind. They were occupying a role. But congruence means that the therapist is exactly themselves. And these things Rogers thought were very, very important. So this kind of working therapeutically is sometimes known as person-centered therapy, or more commonly counseling. This is the idea, the therapeutic ideas, the therapeutic theory that underpins the idea of counseling. So around this time as well, there were other things happening in psychology. One of the other things that was happening was the cognitive revolution. So this idea that came along with computing, the idea that actually the idea that humans were like computers, in that we function like computers, in that there was input and output of information. And several people started to think along these lines. Albert Ellis was one, but also this person, and this is Albert Beck. Aaron Beck. Aaron Beck was training to be a psychoanalyst, like a lot of practitioners, mental health practitioners were at that time. But he noticed in his patients, and he noticed in his own journal, which he kept, that actually a lot of the issues weren't around unconscious thoughts. They were often around the conscious thoughts that these patients were having and that he was having. And what he said was that cognitive therapy seeks to alleviate psychological stresses by correcting faulty conceptions and self-signals. By correcting erroneous beliefs, we can lower excessive reactions. So what that essentially means is that correcting faulty conceptions means the way we understand the world, the way we think about things. And self-signals means the way we think about ourselves. And so essentially, this has become the idea of cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, as it introduces some aspects of behavior as well. So one way to understand this is through this, which is often called a cross-sectional formulation, or sometimes the 5-factor model. But it's a way of understanding ourselves, a way of understanding a reaction to a trigger. So, for example, the way we can understand something is in a situation, if something happens to us, we can understand that we have thoughts, what was going through our mind, our behavior, what did we do, how did we react, our emotions, what we're feeling, and our bodily sensations, what was happening in your body. And by looking at these four domains that intersect and operate and affect each other, we can understand ourselves and make changes. And cognitive behavioral therapy means that the cognitions, the thoughts, and the behaviors are actually very important, because emotions are very difficult to affect, as are bodily sensations, but we can change thoughts and behaviors. So, for example, cognitive therapy would sometimes look at these, what we call unhelpful thinking styles. For example, one of these is catastrophizing. So we blow things out of proportion. So, we think, oh, I didn't send that email. What's my boss going to think? He's going to think I'm terrible. Maybe he'll sack me. I'll lose my job. I'll lose my family. I'll end up on the streets. That kind of catastrophizing that we do. And these are cognitive biases that the research has shown that we all possess. There is also all or nothing thinking, sometimes called black and white thinking. If I'm not perfect, I've failed. Either I do it right or I don't do it at all. We find it very difficult to operate in the gray areas, and we decide that we need to think of something all or nothing. So what cognitive behavioral therapy would do, it's a very active type of therapy, is ask you to record these things, record situations, emotions, physical sensations, and then unhelpful thoughts. And then would ask you to come up with a more alternative or realistic thought or a more balanced perspective and a different behavior. So that's what it would aim to change. The behavior, for example, gets focused on because sometimes, for example, when people are feeling quite depressed, they don't have a lot of motivation to do things. But actually, one of the things that we've found is that behavioral activation, actually doing something, improves mood. And so what you would do with a cognitive behavioral therapist is perhaps come up with a weekly activity schedule to do small things that would help lift mood. And so these basic principles are probably what you would experience if you went to see a cognitive behavioral therapist. So we can see how from Freud through Rogers to Aaron Beck and cognitive behavioral therapy, those are the three main therapeutic models that you would probably see or you would probably experience if you went to see a therapist. There are others, but those are the three main ones.